How's it going, everyone? It's Chow here, and today we are going to talk a little bit about speciation, so let's get started. Now, before speciation can actually occur, oftentimes there's some kind of event to sort of trigger it, so a triggering event, if you might. And these two sort of triggering events often happen independently. The first type of triggering event is dispersal and colonization. So dispersal and colonization is pretty straightforward, I think. You have an original population that's in part of the mainland, so you can think of this as the mainland continent. And then finally, you have some individuals, in this case it looks like lizards, that raft themselves to an island to form a founding population. Now, this founding population is ultimately going to go through population drift as well as selection in this new habitat, which over time finishes with two different quote-unquote populations, which can potentially be defined as two species. On the other hand, you can have another sort of triggering event for speciation, and that's vicariance. Vicariance is not the actual physical movement of the animals or the organisms. I shouldn't just say animals, it can be plants also. It's not the physical movement per se of the organisms, but it's the physical movement of the environment. So what can happen is you have a situation where there's one population, and then suddenly the river changes course. And when the river changes course, you create two different populations that become separated by some kind of a physical barrier, in this case, the river that changed course. And these two different populations ultimately begin to diverge through drift and selection, and these are terms that you probably should know because they're pretty important to understanding speciation. And after drift and selection, you ultimately end up with two different populations that might be different from one another. And if these two populations are different from one another, you can potentially consider them to be different species. Now let's look at the whole concept of speciation itself. Well, speciation can occur through two different means. The first means is through allopatric speciation, which means there's some kind of a physical division of a population. The river coming over here is a physical division. The physical division through isolation because of the island, that's another type of allopatric speciation. But speciation can also occur, albeit a little bit more rare, even within the same population itself. So you can have the same population of trees, and suddenly there can be a speciation that occurs within. And sympatric speciation, which is speciation within the same population without any physical barriers, is usually due to disruptive selection or maybe polyploidy in that same given area. So let's look a little bit more closely at these two different concepts of speciation. The first one, as I mentioned, is allopatric speciation, which occurs when populations are separated by a physical barrier. There's something blocking those populations and preventing that mix of genes, preventing that gene flow, some kind of a barrier. So it's often through dispersal, colonization, or vicariance. So dispersal and colonization or vicariance often causes, or at least makes the situation much more easy for allopatric speciation. So it's a prerequisite, you can think of it as. So this often is thought to be the dominant mode of speciation in most groups. So this mode is very cool because you have an original population, some kind of a physical barrier. They evolve through drift and selection, or they evolve through selection, but can also go through drift, keep that separate. And ultimately, you end up with two different populations that might not be able to interbreed and therefore can potentially be considered different species. On the other hand, you have sympatric speciation, which is just a small population forms a new species in the midst of its parent population, as we can see over here with this situation over here. So again, physical divide causes potentially allopatric speciation, whereas sympatric speciation, you can see there's no physical divide here, yet speciation still occurs. So it's speciation in the same geographical region without any environmental or physical barrier. And this can occur in plants oftentimes due to ploidy changes. So how many sets of chromosomes you have. Plants are sometimes notorious for having multiple sets of chromosomes, and if for some reason one particular original founding species gains a new set of chromosomes, that can allow for speciation to occur. But at the basis of all, keep in mind that when it comes to speciation, oftentimes there are going to be potentially dispersal and colonization events or vicariance events. There are two different types of speciation that can occur. You can have allopatric due to physical separation, or sympatric, still in the same area, but due to some kind of a selection, maybe genetically, some kind of a barrier in terms of the sets of chromosomes, and ultimately that can result in the evolution of a new species. So we're looking at sort of pushing on to more macroevolution concepts. And these things I think are very important to keep in mind as you're going on through in many of your biology courses. So I hope you found that useful, and as always, best of luck studying.